The wind came low and restless, lifting dust across the platform in small, stinging swirls. The station sat lonely on the edge of the prairie, nothing but open grassland stretching in every direction, the horizon wavering in the late afternoon heat. The boards underfoot creaked as Cal Rourke stepped down from the car, a sack of feed balanced over one shoulder and the day's mail tucked under his arm. His wagon was tied out front, two bays flicking their tails against the last of the summer flies. The train's whistle gave one final cry, sharp and hollow in the empty air, and the wheels began to turn. Cal shifted his weight, watching the cars roll past, their windows flashing with the setting sun. That was when he noticed her. She stood near the far end of the platform, just beyond the shadow of the depot's awning. A young woman in a traveling dress that had seen better days, her hair pinned up tight but with a few strands shaken loose by the wind. She gripped a worn leather satchel with both hands, holding it in front of her like it might keep her upright. Beside her feet was nothing, no trunk, no carpet bag, no other luggage at all. Cal's gaze tracked the man who had been speaking to her moments ago, well-dressed, hat tipped low, the sort of fellow who looked like he'd never missed a meal. He boarded the last passenger car without looking back, and as the conductor swung the step up and latched the door, the woman's chin lifted just a fraction enough to look like she was steady. But Cal had been around long enough to recognize the kind of steadiness that cost something to hold. The train gathered speed, iron wheels clattering, and she didn't move. She watched it go until it was no more than a dark line against the grass, the plume of smoke stretching thin in the wind. Only then did her eyes close for half a heartbeat, the barest crack in her composure, before she straightened again. Cal adjusted the feed sack on his shoulder and stepped toward her. "You got someone meeting you?" he asked, keeping his voice low, the way you'd speak to a skittish horse. Her eyes flicked to him, a pale green that caught the light, and then shuddered just as quick. "No." He nodded once, not pushing. "Train headed your way again tomorrow?" She let out a small breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Not for 3 days." Her voice was flat, not unkind, just worn. "You got a place to stay till then?" Her fingers tightened on the satchel. "No place here." The wind cut between them, lifting the hem of her skirt and carrying the scent of coal smoke away into the prairie. Cal watched her a moment longer. Whatever had just happened on that platform, she wasn't going to tell him outright, but he could see the weight of it in her shoulders. "Station master'll be locking up soon," he said. "Gets cold at night." She glanced toward the depot doors, then back at the empty tracks. Her jaw worked, but she didn't answer. Cal shifted the mail under his arm and took one slow step closer. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I'll take you home if you'll let me." For the first time since he'd seen her, she looked directly at him, searching his face like she might find the trick in it. When she didn't, she swallowed and straightened her spine. The quiet between them was thick as the dust in the air, but she didn't turn away. The light was slipping westward, stretching the shadows of the telegraph poles long and thin across the prairie. Cal shifted the feed sack to the crook of his arm, letting the mail slide into the other hand. The woman hadn't moved much since the train left, just stood there, gripping that satchel like it held her last coin. "You got someone meeting you?" he asked again, the words plain and without any edge. She shook her head once, slow. "No, my family's 3 days' ride east." Her voice carried the flat cadence of someone stating a fact she didn't much care to explain. "I've no money for the ticket back." Cal nodded, eyes narrowing slightly against the wind. A man could say a lot about himself without speaking, and hers was written clear enough in the set of her shoulders and the way she looked past him instead of at him. She wasn't used to asking for help, and she wasn't about to start now. The station master stepped out onto the platform, a short, round man with a kerchief tucked in his collar. He cast a glance at the sky. "Sun'll be down in an hour," he said, half to them, half to himself. "Wind'll turn before then." Mara's fingers flexed against the satchel. Cal could tell she was already weighing her options, none of them good. A room at the boarding house in town would cost coin she didn't have. Sleeping in the depot wasn't much better. The stove in there barely took the chill off once the night settled in. Cal felt the hesitation in his own gut before he spoke. It wasn't his way to meddle in other folks' business, but the idea of leaving her here alone gnawed at him. "I'll take you home," he said, steady as a post, "if you'll let me." Her eyes found his then, sharp and searching. "Why?" He gave the smallest shrug. "Because it's too far to walk, and no good comes from being stranded here." She studied him like a person might study a trail they weren't sure was safe, slow, cautious, measuring each step in her mind before she took it. There was pride in her stare, but beneath it, something else flickered, wary necessity. The station master clanged the depot door shut behind him, muttering about the cold wind rolling in from the north. The boards underfoot popped and groaned with the drop in temperature. "You've got your own place?" she asked finally. "Ranch about an hour west," Cal said. "Plenty of room. I can see you back to your people when you're ready." She looked out over the prairie like she might find an answer there. The sky had gone the color of tarnished brass, the kind that warned of a cold night. She let out a slow breath, not quite surrender but close enough. "All right," she said, voice low. "But just to my family." Cal tipped his hat once. "That's the deal." He turned toward the wagon, hearing her footsteps fall in behind him, light but deliberate. The wind was colder now, biting at the edges of the day, and he thought not for the first time that some offers you make because you have to, and some because it just wouldn't sit right to do anything else. This was both. The wagon creaked in a slow, steady rhythm as the team pulled them west, hooves thudding against the hard-packed dirt. The road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon, running straight into the low sun. Mara sat stiff on the bench beside Cal, her back straight, gloved hands locked around the strap of her satchel, as though it might keep her from sliding away. The leather looked worn soft from years of use, edges fraying where the stitching had started to give. Cal kept his eyes forward, the reins loose in his hands. He'd hauled freight, driven cattle, and crossed more miles of prairie than he cared to count, but this felt different. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, was just guarded. He could feel it in the way she angled herself ever so slightly toward the far side of the seat, as if to make clear she didn't owe him more than the space she took up. They passed a wind-bent cottonwood standing alone in the grass, its silver leaves flashing in the breeze. The sound of them rustling was like dry rain. Further on, the road dipped through a small stand of trees where the air cooled, and the scent of wood smoke curled through the branches. Mara turned her face into the wind, closing her eyes for a moment, and he wondered if the smell reminded her of some place she'd rather be or of something she'd rather forget. He didn't push. Some things you learned by listening when the words finally came, and not a second before. Still, after another mile, he asked, "Where were you headed?" His voice was mild, a question without demand. She opened her eyes and looked ahead, her jaw tightening before she answered. "Dry Creek," she said. "That's a good ways south of here." "I know." She adjusted her grip on the satchel, fingers tensing over the worn leather. "I was promised work there." Her gaze dropped to the road, rolling out in front of them, her tone cooling as she added, "And a wedding." Cal didn't look at her, but his hands shifted on the reins. "Neither happened, I take it." "Neither's happening," she said flatly. Her voice didn't waver, but there was something in it, a thread pulled too tight that told him the rest was a story she wasn't ready to tell. "Man boarded the train without me, took the ticket, took my things." The wagon rattled over a rut, and Cal steadied the team with a light pull. "That so?" "Yes." She looked off toward the horizon, where the prairie met the faint shadow of hills. "Guess I was easier to leave behind than I thought." Cal didn't answer right away. He'd known men who measured their worth in what they could take from others, and he recognized the kind of hurt they left in their wake. After a moment, he said, "Then he's a fool. Simple as that." Mara didn't respond, but she eased her grip on the satchel, just a little. The sun sank lower, painting the grass in gold, and the sound of the wheels on the dirt road filled the quiet. They rode on, the land opening wide around them, and though neither spoke again for some time, the air between them felt a shade less cold. The last of the daylight had drained from the sky by the time the wagon rolled into Cal Rourke's yard. The horizon was a deep band of purple, the moon just a pale smudge climbing above the ridge. Lantern light glowed faintly from the porch, casting long shadows over the packed dirt. The horses snorted as they came to a stop, their breath steaming in the cooling air. Cal set the brake and climbed down first, boots hitting the ground with a solid thump. He offered a hand, but Mara stepped down on her own, her satchel clutched tight. She stood a moment beside the wagon, eyes sweeping over the house and the outbuildings, the weathered barn, the small chicken coop tucked near the fence, the woodpile stacked high against the side of the shed. It wasn't a large spread, but everything was in its place. "This way," Cal said, leading her up the short porch steps. The boards creaked under their weight, the smell of wood smoke stronger now. He opened the door and stepped aside for her to enter. Inside, the air was warm and carried the faint scent of stew that had been left simmering earlier in the day. The main room was simply a worn rug underfoot, a table with 2 chairs, a small shelf lined with a few books and a row of mugs. Beyond it, a narrow hallway led to the bedrooms. Cal stopped at the second door and pushed it open. "Spare room," he said. The lamplight from the hall spilled in, revealing a neat, plain space. The bed was made with a faded quilt folded square at the foot. A small chest sat against the wall, and a single chair stood in the corner. There was nothing frilly or fancy, but everything was clean. Mara stepped inside slowly, her gaze taking in each detail as if she expected something hidden a catch to the offer she hadn't yet heard. She set her satchel on the chair but didn't let go of the strap. Her shoulders were still tight, her chin lifted like she was braced for the moment. The real cost of his hospitality would be named. Cal leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, his voice even. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward the main room. "Eat if you're hungry." She glanced at him, surprised, as if she'd expected something else entirely. "That's all?" "That's all," he said. "You can lock the door from the inside if you want." For a beat, neither moved. Then Mara loosened her grip on the satchel and set it fully on the chair. "All right," she murmured. Cal straightened, tipped his hat back slightly. "Rest. It's a long ride back to town, and you'll want your strength if you're heading to your folks in a few days." Without another word, he stepped away, the sound of his boots fading toward the kitchen. She stood in the small room, listening to the faint clink of dishes as he moved about. The quilt on the bed looked warm, the pillow soft enough to sink into. She sat down slowly, feeling the strange weight of safety settle over her, fragile but real. For the first time since the train pulled away, her hands were empty, and she let them rest in her lap, unsure whether to believe it would last. The faint gray light of morning pressed against the curtains when Mara opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't move, letting the stillness of the room settle around her. Then the smell reached her strong coffee, the kind that seemed to carry the whole weight of a day in its steam, and something warm and yeasty, like bread just pulled from an oven. She sat up, brushing her hair back with her fingers, and swung her feet to the floor. The quilt slid from her lap, pooling at her ankles, and the chill of the plank boards made her catch her breath. She pulled on her boots and opened the door quietly, following the scent into the main room. Cal was at the stove, pouring coffee into a tin mug. He moved without hurry, every gesture measured, like a man who had no one to answer to but himself. The bread sat on a cutting board, steam curling from its crust where it had been sliced, and a skillet on the stove popped softly with something frying. Mara lingered in the doorway, watching him for a moment. He didn't look over his shoulder, but she had the sense he knew she was there. "Coffee's hot," he said. "Bread's fresh if you want some." She stepped into the room, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I can help," she said. Cal set the mug down and glanced at her. "You can if you want," he said simply. "But you're not in my debt." The words made her pause, She wasn't used to that, no silent tally being kept, no unspoken payment expected. She nodded once and stepped closer, rolling her sleeves above her elbows. What needs doing? He jerked his chin toward a sack of potatoes on the counter. Could use those peeled, might stretch the stew from last night. She pulled a chair over and sat, the paring knife fitting neatly into her hand. The first curl of potato skin fell to the bowl at her feet, pale against the rough wood. She worked steadily, the scrape of blade against flesh, a quiet rhythm that matched the low hiss from the stove. Cal moved around her, checking the fire, slicing more bread, stepping outside briefly to bring in wood for the box by the hearth. He didn't fill the air with words, and she found she didn't mind. The silence wasn't sharp, it gave her room to breathe. By the time the last potato was peeled, her shoulders had dropped from their tight hold, and the knot between her ribs had eased just enough to notice. Cal took the bowl from her with a nod, setting it beside the stew pot. "You work neat," he said. "6 brothers," she replied, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I was the oldest." He gave a short, almost smile, as though that explained more than she realized. That'd do it. The coffee was still hot when she poured herself a mug, and the bread was soft under her fingers. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt something close to calm-like, maybe, for this morning at least. She didn't have to be braced for what came next. The sun was high enough to warm the tops of the grass, but the breeze coming off the prairie still carried the edge of last night's chill. Cal walked ahead, a coil of wire slung over his shoulder, and Mara followed with a small canvas bag of tools bumping against her hip. The pasture opened wide on both sides, the fence running straight until it dipped toward a shallow draw where the posts leaned like tired men. Cal stopped at one of the worst spots, a section where the wire had snapped and curled back on itself. The post there was cracked halfway through, the top swaying slightly when the wind pressed against it. He set down the coil and crouched to inspect the break. "Not much holding this together," he said. Mara knelt across from him, squinting at the tangle. "Looks like it's been this way for a while." He handed her the end of the loose wire. "Hold it steady while I get the splice started." She gripped it firmly, the metal cool in her hands. For a while the only sounds were the creak of the pliers, the clink of the tensioner, and the low whistle of the wind through the grass. Cal worked without waste, each twist of the wire sure and even. Halfway through, Mara spoke without looking up. "You asked me the other day where I was headed." Cal didn't pause. "I did." She wet her lips, her voice quiet, but steady. "The man on the platform, the one who left me, he'd been courting me since spring. Told me there was work in Dry Creek, and once I got there we'd be married." Cal's eyes lifted briefly to her face, then returned to the splice. "And? And what he didn't tell me was that he wanted my father's land." She adjusted her grip on the wire, her knuckles whitening. "Only, the land was already gone. Sold after my father died, before I could even think about claiming it. My uncle handled the papers. I didn't know until I went to pack my things and found strangers living there." Cal kept working, his hands steady. "So the man cut his losses." She let out a breath that was more bitterness than air. "That's a polite way of saying he took what he could and ran." He pulled the wire tight, testing the tension before securing it. "Then he's the one that lost out." She looked at him, surprised by the lack of pity in his tone. He wasn't softening the truth, but he wasn't twisting the knife either. Just stating it plain, like it was a fact she could set down and walk away from. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage from somewhere down the draw. Cal straightened, brushing the dust from his hands. "That should hold for a while," he said. Mara stood, the sun catching in her hair where the pins had loosened. "Thank you." He met her eyes, and for a moment, neither looked away. The silence between them had changed, not the stiff, guarded kind from the day before, but something that felt steady, unhurried. They walked back toward the house side by side, the repaired fence line stretching behind them, neat and whole. The air between them held no promise and no demand, but something had settled there all the same. Morning settled over the ranch in a slow, golden stretch, the light spilling across the yard and catching on the dust motes drifting through the open kitchen window. Mara was already moving before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She'd started the fire, pulled the coffee from the stove before it boiled over, and had biscuits in the oven by the time Cal came in from checking the horses. She didn't ask what needed doing anymore. By now, she knew the rhythm of the place. After breakfast, she washed the plates while Cal stacked the woodpile higher, the sound of the logs thudding into place marking the steady pace of the morning. She mended a tear in one of his work shirts while the bread rose, her needle slipping in and out of the fabric with practiced ease. The hem of her skirt brushed the floor as she moved between table and stove, sleeves rolled high enough to keep them from dipping into the dishwater. Sometimes, without realizing it, she hummed while she worked low, tuneless, the sound of a mind turned inward. Cal noticed it the first time she fed the chickens, her voice barely carrying over the rustle of feathers. She didn't seem aware of it, and he didn't say anything, only watched from the barn door for a moment before turning back to the saddles he was oiling. They fell into a pattern. Cal would bring in the firewood in the late afternoon, setting it by the stove without a word. Mara would hand him a mug of coffee as he came through the door, the handle already turned toward him. In the evenings, they ate at the small kitchen table, the light from the oil lamp pooling between them. Sometimes they talked about small things, the weather, the stubborn cow that kept breaking the same section of fence. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, and the silence felt easy. She took to the stock as though she'd been raised among them, checking the water troughs without being told, scattering feed for the hens, and rubbing down the gelding after Cal came back from the lower pasture. The animals responded to her quiet manner, and more than once Cal found the barn oddly peaceful in her presence, the usual restlessness of the place settled by her steady hands. One evening she was out by the pump rinsing a basket of carrots, the orange skins flashing under the stream. Cal leaned against the porch rail, watching her laugh at the way one of the barn cats kept pawing at the water, batting at its reflection. Her laugh was quick and light, and it caught him off guard not because it was loud, but because it fit here, as though it had always belonged in the air between the house and the barn. When she carried the carrots inside, the smell of stew already rising from the pot, Mara paused in the doorway. The room was warm, the light soft, the chairs in their familiar place. It wasn't her hominot yet, but as she set the basket down on the counter, she realized she didn't feel like a stranger anymore. The thought settled in her quietly, like a stone finding its place in the riverbed, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself think she might belong somewhere again. The wagon wheels hummed low over the hard-packed road, a steady sound beneath the creak of leather and the soft jingle of harness rings. The sky was a pale winter blue, the kind that felt thin enough to crack if the wind pressed too hard. Mara sat beside Cal on the bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. In the back, a short list of needs waited to be filled: flour, salt, lamp oil, and whatever nails Cal could bargain for at the smithy. Town came into view slowly, its edges blurred by dust from a passing stage. A few buildings leaned against the cold, boards silvered by years of sun and wind. The general store's wide front windows reflected the bright sky, while the blacksmith's forge spat a faint curl of smoke. Cal guided the team down the main street, pulling them to a stop in front of the store. Inside, the air smelled of kerosene and dry goods, heavy with the faint sweetness of molasses stored in barrels near the back. Mara moved to the fabric counter, running her fingertips over bolts of plain cotton, searching for something sturdy enough for work aprons. Cal was at the front, speaking to the storekeeper about nails and hinges. She had just chosen a length of slate gray cloth when the door swung open behind her, letting in a slice of cold air. The sound of boots crossing the floor came quick, sharp. She knew the rhythm before she turned, and her stomach tightened. He stood there, her former fiancé hat in his hands, eyes sweeping over her like he had the right. The shock on his face was plain, though it shifted quickly into something slicker, like charm worn thin. "Mara," he said, voice pitched low, as if they shared some secret. She didn't answer, her fingers tightening on the fabric. I looked for you, he went on, stepping closer. Things didn't go as I planned, but we can. He stopped, and she felt why before she saw it. Cal was there, stepping in without a sound, his frame filling the space between them. He didn't touch her, didn't say a word, but his presence was a wall the other man couldn't see past. The air shifted, her former fiancé's mouth pressed into a line. He glanced at Cal, weighing something in his mind, then tipped his hat in a motion that carried no respect at all. Without another word, he turned and left, the door banging softly behind him. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Cal glanced back at her once, the look in his eyes calm, unreadable, before turning toward the counter to finish his purchase. They left the store together, the gray cloth tucked under her arm, the supplies packed neatly in the wagon. She climbed up beside him, the bench cold under her palms, and as the horses started forward, she realized the tight coil in her chest had eased. The road back was quiet, but it wasn't the strained silence of before. It was something different, warmer. She sat a little straighter, the gray cloth resting in her lap, and felt a quiet sense of safety bloom where fear had once taken root. The sky had been threatening all morning, heavy clouds rolling in low from the northwest, their underbellies a shade too dark to ignore. By midday, the first flakes had started to drift down soft, harmless things that melted as soon as they touched the ground. But the wind shifted, snapping colder, and by the time Cal came in from the east pasture, the air was thick with white. It's coming fast, he said, pulling his gloves off at the door. We've got maybe an hour before it blinds us in the yard. Mara was already tugging on her coat, tying her scarf snug under her chin. Then we'd better move. They went first to the chicken coop, the snow catching in their lashes as they crossed the yard. The hens were restless, clucking sharp and loud against the wind's whistle. Mara crouched to gather the last few eggs while Cal checked the latches, making sure no drift could pile high enough to push the door in. From there they headed to the barn, the drifts deepening with every step. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of hay and animals, but the wind still found its way through the gaps in the siding, sending thin ribbons of snow across the floor. Cal worked at the far end, moving the horses into the inner stalls where the cold wouldn't cut so deep. Mara kept close to the feed bins, filling buckets for the cattle penned along the south wall. They moved quickly, not wasting words, their boots crunching on the packed dirt, the lantern swaying above them. By the time the last stall was latched, the storm outside had turned to a full white curtain. Cal shouldered open the barn door, and the wind shoved back hard enough to stagger them both. Snow whipped across the yard, stinging their faces, coating their coats in seconds. Mara kept her head down, pushing through the gale toward the house. By the time she reached the porch, her hair was dusted white, the frost clinging in small crystals along the loose strands at her temple. Cal was right behind her, stomping the snow from his boots before stepping inside. Here, he said, catching her by the elbow. He guided her toward the hearth, pulling a blanket from the peg and wrapping it around her shoulders. His hands were brisk but careful, tucking the edges in as if sealing the warmth close to her. She looked up, the lamplight catching on the frost in her hair, and he brushed a strand back without thinking. They ate by the fire, bowls of hot stew warming their hands. The wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the panes shiver in their frames. Outside was nothing but howling white, but inside the air was still, broken only by the soft crack of the logs. Neither spoke of it, but the awareness was there how easily the place could feel empty without the other in it. Mara's eyes lingered on him a moment too long when he leaned forward to stir the fire. Cal caught the look, held it, then let it go without a word. The storm pressed on into the night, but the walls held, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in days, neither of them minded the thought of being snowed in. Morning came slow, the light outside dim and soft, the snow still drifting in lazy spirals past the kitchen window. The storm had lost its fury, leaving the yard blanketed in a thick, unbroken sheet of white. The air inside was warm, scented with coffee and the faint sweetness of wood smoke. Mara sat at the small kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug, letting the heat sink into her fingers. Cal moved quietly, setting another log on the firebox of the stove. His coat hung by the door, still dusted with snow from when he'd gone out to check the barn. The horses were fine, the hens restless but safe, and the drifts piled high enough along the fence line that it would be a day or two before the road was worth attempting. He crossed the room and poured himself a mug, leaning against the counter with his eyes on her. For a while, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that had grown easy between them, not the wary stillness of strangers but the quiet of people who didn't need to fill the air. "I can take you home," he said finally, his voice low but steady, "if you still want that." He let the words settle before adding, "Or, you could stay." She looked up from her coffee, her gaze flicking to the window, then around the kitchen. The quilted potholder hanging by the stove, the wood stacked neat by the door. The faint creak of the house settling against the cold. Her eyes came back to him, lingering a little longer this time. "What if I stayed?" she asked. Cal didn't look away. "Then I'd ask you to be my wife," he said. "Not because you need a place, but because I want you here." The words were plain, without flourish, but they carried a weight she could feel. There was no bargaining in them, no edge of obligation, just truth. She felt something in her chest loosen, the last bit of ground she'd been holding as if she might still have to run. Her mouth curved into a slow, quiet smile. "Then ask." He set his mug down, the sound of it against the counter soft in the stillness. "Mara Lee," he said, straightening a little. "Will you stay here with me? Will you be my wife?" She held his gaze, her fingers tightening slightly around the mug before she set it aside. "Yes," she said, the word clear, sure, without hesitation. Cal's shoulders eased, though he didn't move toward her right away. He studied her face like he wanted to remember it exactly as it was in that moment, the calm, the warmth, the certainty. Then he stepped closer, resting one hand lightly over hers on the table. Outside, the snow drifted silently against the window, the world wrapped in white. Inside, the kitchen was warm, the fire steady, and for the first time in a long while, Mara felt like she'd stepped into a place that was not just shelter, but home.